April 27th, 1942, 04:21 hours. The searchlight cut through the North Atlantic fog like a blade. Commander Alistair Blackwood gripped the rail of the patrol boat, his knuckles white against the cold steel. Below him, the water churned black and violent. The winch screamed, 30 feet of steel cable stretched taut, droplets of seawater spraying across the deck. Something massive strained against it, something that shouldn't be there. Blackwood had commanded harbour defences for 8 months. He'd seen fouled nets before, debris, fishing trawlers tangled in the dark. Once a British submarine during training exercises, her captain red-faced with embarrassment, but this was different. The hydrophone operator's voice cracked through the speaker. "Pressure hull breach detected, sir. She's blowing ballast tanks." Blackwood's chest tightened. Through the murky water, caught in the harsh glare of the searchlight, a grey shape emerged. The distinctive bow planes of a German Type 6C U-boat broke the surface, wrapped in hundreds of feet of wire mesh. Not the heavy submarine nets protecting every other British naval installation. This mesh looked absurdly delicate. 3/8 of an inch wire rope woven into 6-foot squares, the design that senior officers at the Admiralty had called laughably inadequate. The pattern that Captain Edmund Thornhill had dismissed as no stronger than herring nets. The U-boat wallowed helplessly, her diving planes tangled, her propeller shaft fouled with wire. 750 tons of German engineering strangled by what looked like fishing gear. 52 German submariners would surrender within the hour. What Thornhill didn't know was that this was the second U-boat Blackwood's ridiculous net had captured in 48 hours. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the searchlights, a third submarine was approaching, her commander studying charts that were already obsolete. But that victory was still 9 days away. This is the story of how it began. 8 weeks earlier, January the 22, 1942. The statistics arrived at the Admiralty building in Portsmouth every Monday morning. Neat columns of numbers on cream-coloured paper. Tonnage lost. Ships sunk. Men drowned. The clerks who typed these reports had stopped reading the names months ago. It was easier that way. Commander Alistair Blackwood read every single one. January's losses, 273,000 tons of Allied shipping sent to the bottom of the Atlantic. 11 million tons since September 1939. 12 million men depended on those ships for food, for fuel, for the weapons and raw materials that kept Britain fighting. At this rate of loss, Churchill's military planners gave Britain 8 months. 8 months before starvation forced a negotiated peace with Hitler. The submarine menace wasn't confined to the open ocean. Admiral Karl Dönitz's U-boat commanders had discovered something even more lucrative. They hunted at the very thresholds of British harbours. Convoy escorts, exhausted after crossing 3,000 miles of ocean under constant threat, typically broke formation within sight of port. Merchant captains, believing the worst behind them, relaxed their vigilance. The approaches to Liverpool, Glasgow and the Firth of Clyde had become killing grounds. Between January and April 1942, German submarines sank 47 merchant vessels within 10 miles of British coastal installations, 2 Royal Navy destroyers, thousands of tons of American war materials that would never reach British shores. Blackwood had watched one of those ships die. December 14, 1941. He'd been standing on the shore at Greenock, coordinating harbour defences, when HMS Volunteer took a torpedo 2 miles from safety. The destroyer broke in half, sank in 4 minutes. 180 men went down with her. Blackwood had served aboard Volunteer 6 years earlier. He knew the names of 17 men who died that day, knew their faces, knew which ones had families waiting. The harbour defences had failed. The old nets, the massive anti-submarine barriers that had supposedly protected British waters since the First World War, might as well have been tissue paper. That night, Blackwood began designing something different. The Royal Navy's standard submarine net had been developed during the First World War. Massive constructions of 5 to 8 inch flexible steel wire rope woven into 12-foot square mesh. They hung from enormous timber bulks weighing several tons each. These barriers stretched from the surface to depths of 120 feet, anchored with rendering winches designed to absorb the impact of a ramming submarine. In theory, they were impregnable. In practice, they were failing at an unacceptable rate. Commander Ian Campbell, who supervised net defenses at the Rosyth Naval Base, had documented the problem in a January report. Of 18 net sections installed between September and November 1941, 11 required complete replacement due to storm damage, corrosion, or structural failure. The nets were also extraordinarily expensive. A single 400-foot section required 8 miles of heavy wire rope and cost £5,000 to manufacture, the equivalent of 2 Spitfire fighters. They were agonizingly slow to install. The net defences at Scapa Flow, the Home Fleet's primary anchorage, had taken 14 months to complete, and they required constant maintenance. Saltwater corrosion attacked the wire relentlessly. The strong currents of Scottish sea locks twisted the nets into useless tangles. Ice damage in winter, storm damage year-round. But the worst revelation came from a classified file that crossed Blackwood's desk in late January. On October 28, 1918, the German submarine UB-116 had penetrated the supposedly impregnable Scapa Flow net defences. Not by ramming them, not by surfacing and cutting through. The boat had simply used bow-mounted shears to sever the heavy cables. Cut through like garden scissors through twine, UB-116 was eventually destroyed by mines. But the net barrier itself had offered virtually no resistance. British naval intelligence had never learned of this incident during the interwar period. The German naval archives had been captured after the armistice, but this particular report had been buried, classified, forgotten. Blackwood read it 3 times. Then he began calculating. February 8, 1942, Portsmouth Admiralty. The conference room smelled of pipe tobacco and old wood polish. Charts lined the walls showing the locations of submarine net defences around the British Isles. Red pins marked where installations were complete. Yellow pins showed ongoing construction. Far too many yellow pins. Blackwood stood before an audience of senior naval architects and staff officers. His presentation boards showed diagrams, calculations, cost comparisons. His hands were steady, but his throat was dry. Captain Edmund Thornhill sat at the head of the table, 52 years old, Distinguished Service Cross from the Battle of Jutland, Chief of Harbour Defences for the Admiralty. His face showed the kind of certainty that came from 3 decades of naval service. The kind of certainty that didn't appreciate junior officers questioning established wisdom. Blackwood began. Gentlemen, the problem with our current nets is that we're trying to stop a submarine with brute strength. A 750-ton U-boat moving at 6 knots submerged has tremendous momentum, 8,000 pounds of force. Our nets must be strong enough to halt that momentum, which means heavy wire, heavy floats, heavy everything. He flipped to the next board. The result is a defence that costs £5,000 per section, takes 6 months to install, and fails 60% of the time within the first year. Commander James Morrison, the Admiralty's Materials Research Officer, leaned forward. We're aware of the maintenance issues, Commander Blackwood, but the alternative is no defence at all. The alternative, sir, is to stop trying to halt the submarine. Instead, we tangle it. Blackwood unveiled his next diagram, a rendering of a U-boat caught in fine mesh, wire wrapped around diving planes and propeller shaft. A submarine moving at 6 knots generates 8,000 pounds of force, but that force is useless if the boat can't maintain forward motion. German U-boats are equipped with bow shears specifically designed to sever cables up to 3/4 of an inch thick. They cut through our current nets like pruning shears through rope. He tapped the diagram. But they can't cut mesh, not easily. Not when that mesh is 3/8 of an inch flexible steel wire woven into a much finer pattern. 6-foot squares instead of 12. The boat encounters not one cable to cut, but hundreds of crossing wires, each individually too light to stop the submarine, but collectively forming a web that fouls every moving surface. Thornhill's expression hadn't changed. Herring nets. Sir? You want to defend His Majesty's harbours with herring nets, Commander? The room went silent. The mesh pattern is similar to commercial fishing nets, yes, sir. But the principle is different. Instead of presenting a rigid barrier, the system uses yielding. Hydraulic rendering winches with governors that feed out cable under strain. The net gives way, absorbing momentum instead of resisting it, while the fine mesh progressively tangles the submarine's control surfaces and propulsion. Morrison shook his head. Well, Commander, we've tested lighter nets. They fail under stress. A submarine pushes through them like they're not even there. That's because you tested them hung statically from heavy buoys, sir. My design uses a yielding system. The net absorbs the impact, wraps around the boat, and binds the propeller shaft. The submarine's own forward motion becomes its prison. Blackwood stepped to the cost comparison board. £840 per section, 14 days installation time. Minimal maintenance because the lighter weight generates far less strain on moorings and connections. He looked directly at Thornhill. 1/6 the cost, 1/12 the installation time, and it exploits the fundamental weakness of German bow shears, which are designed to cut heavy cables, not tangle in fine mesh. Thornhill stood up. The room seemed to shrink around him. Gentlemen, I've heard enough. He walked to Blackwood's diagram, studied it for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was cold. Commander Blackwood's theoretical net might work in laboratory conditions, but in the real world, submarines don't politely swim into nets and wait to be caught. They ram them at full power. They use explosive charges. They have cutters precisely designed to defeat this sort of obstacle. He turned to face the room. This design is laughably inadequate, no stronger than herring nets. Approving this ridiculous design would be criminally negligent. Morrison nodded. The mathematics may be sound, Commander, but the physics are against you. Lighter always means weaker. The vote was 8-0. Rejection. Thornhill wasn't finished. Furthermore, I'm placing a formal reprimand in Commander Blackwood's file for wasting Admiralty resources with unworkable proposals. Dismissed. Blackwood gathered his papers in silence. His face burned. His hands shook as he rolled up the diagrams. In the hallway outside, Morrison caught up with him. Tom? Morrison's voice was quiet. The math is sound. I know it is, but the politics... He trailed off. 180 men died on the Volunteer, James, because our defences failed. I know. How many more have to die before we try something different? Morrison had no answer. Blackwood walked out into the February rain. February 10th, 1942. The cottage sat on a hillside overlooking Portsmouth Harbour. Blackwood had made this trip a dozen times as a student 20 years ago, before the war, before everything. Professor Cedric Ashford answered the door on the third knock. 68 years old, white hair, sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He'd taught naval architecture at the Royal Naval College for 40 years before retiring in 1938. Alistair. The old man smiled. You look terrible. I need you to check my calculations, Professor. They spread the diagrams across Ashford's kitchen table. The old professor worked through the mathematics in silence, occasionally making notes in the margins. Outside, rain hammered against the windows. After 30 minutes, Ashford sat back. This is brilliant, Thomas, absolutely brilliant. The yielding coefficient here, the mesh tensile distribution, the hydrodynamic modeling. Who told you it wouldn't work? The entire Admiralty Technical Board. Then the entire Admiralty Technical Board is wrong. Blackwood felt something unlock in his chest. You're certain? I've been designing submarine defenses since 1917. I watched them build those monstrous heavy nets at Scapa Flow. Watched them fail again and again. Your design addresses every weakness in the current system. Ashford tapped the cost comparison. And does it for a fraction of the price. Thornhill called it ridiculous. Edmund Thornhill called the steam turbine a passing fad in 1911. The man is an excellent administrator and a terrible engineer. Ashford poured 2 glasses of whiskey. Listen to me, Alistair. I taught you to think differently, to question assumptions. The entire establishment said Brunel's suspension bridge couldn't work, said the cables would snap under their own weight. Now we build them across the world. He pushed 1 glass across the table. Build your net. Prove them wrong. I don't have authorization. Thornhill put a reprimand in my file. Do you have authority over harbour defences at the Clyde? Yes, but then use it. Build a prototype. The regulations allow for experimental modifications under local command authority. I checked before you arrived. Blackwood stared at the diagrams. If it fails, my career is over. If you do nothing, how many more ships like the Volunteer go down? How many more men? The question hung in the air. Ashford opened a drawer, pulled out a checkbook. I'm dying, Alistair. Lung cancer. The doctors give me 6 months, perhaps less. I've no family, no debts, and I would very much like to see one last innovation succeed before I go. He wrote a cheque for £200. Consider it an investment in the future. Build something that works. Show them that the old ways aren't the only ways. February the 15th, 1942. Glasgow Docks. The fishing companies had names like McTavish and Sons, Aberdeen Fisheries, Celtic Marine Supply. Before the war, they'd employed 300 men, sent trawlers into the North Sea and beyond, fed half of Scotland. Now their boats sat idle, their nets rotted in warehouses. The war had destroyed the commercial fishing trade. U-boats made the North Sea a graveyard. Blackwood found them in a pub called the Anchor, 6 captains drowning their boredom in bitter ale. He spread his diagrams on a table, sticky with spilled beer. I need nets, fine mesh, 3/8-inch wire rope, 6-foot spacing, 2,400 feet of it. And I need men who understand how nets behave in strong currents. The men studied his drawings in silence. Finally, an older man spoke. Hamish MacLeod, 56 years old, had commanded Aberdeen trawlers for 20 years before the war made it impossible. This is submarine netting. Yes. Navy boys don't understand nets, Commander. They see cables, weights, physics formulas, but nets aren't about strength. They're about how water moves, how wire rope behaves under strain, how mesh wraps and tangles when something pushes through it. MacLeod traced the mesh pattern with a calloused finger. We hauled herring nets in North Sea gales for 20 years, seen nets catch things they weren't designed to catch, seen them wrap around propeller shafts and engine intakes, seen them strangle fishing boats twice the size of a U-boat. He looked up at Blackwood. Navy brass rejected this? Called it laughably inadequate, MacLeod laughed. Because they don't understand nets. This'll work, Commander. This'll tangle a submarine like seaweed on a winch. I'm paying market rate, but the work has to be quiet. No official contracts, no paperwork that goes through Admiralty channels. You're going around them. I'm using discretionary authority for experimental harbour modifications, technically legal, politically explosive. The 6 captains exchanged glances. We're in, MacLeod said. We've got the fabrication equipment, the wire rope suppliers, and we've got men who need work. When do we start? Tomorrow. For 6 weeks, Blackwood lived in a Glasgow warehouse that smelled of rust and salt water. The fishing crews worked 12-hour days, welding wire rope into mesh, testing every connection, checking tensile strength on equipment borrowed from shipyards. The hydraulic rendering winches were the critical component. Blackwood calibrated them personally, 80 pounds per square inch, yielding at 5,000 pounds of force, 60% of the wire's failure load. The winches would start feeding cable the moment a submarine struck, letting the net envelope the boat instead of creating a rigid barrier. McLeod taught him things no naval academy had covered: how to read water tension in wire rope, how to predict mesh behavior in strong currents, how different weaving patterns affected entanglement characteristics. They tested sections in the Clyde estuary at night, watched how the mesh moved in the water, made adjustments, tested again. Commander Morrison showed up one midnight with 3 crates marked "Damaged, Disposal Authorized." Inside, 200 pounds of wire rope, hydraulic fittings, cable connectors. "Lost in transit," Morrison said. "Happens all the time in wartime. Terrible record keeping." "James, I still think you're wrong about the physics, Tom, but I hope to God you're right about everything else." March 22nd, 1942. Installation Day. The net hung from simple steel drum floats, nothing like the massive timber bulks of standard installations. 2,400 feet of experimental netting stretched across the narrowest approach to the Clyde anchorage. At 45 tons for the complete installation, Blackwood's system weighed less than a single section of conventional netting. The fishermen worked with practiced efficiency. They understood nets in ways naval personnel never would. Blackwood filed the paperwork that afternoon. Experimental modifications to defensive positions approved under local command authority pursuant to Regulation 47, Section 12. Technically accurate, completely misleading. For 4 weeks, nothing happened. Convoys entered the Clyde without incident. U-boat activity seemed concentrated farther south, off Liverpool, in the western approaches. Blackwood began to wonder if his net would ever face a real test. Then, on February 28th, a telegram arrived from Thornhill's office. "Clyde Harbour Defence Audit scheduled 15th April. Prepare full documentation. All modifications last 6 months." Blackwood stared at the telegram for a long time. Thornhill was coming. He'd see the net. He'd see the unauthorized modifications. The reprimand in Blackwood's file would become a court-martial, unless the net proved itself first. Blackwood walked to the harbour that night, stood watching his absurd creation disappear into the dark water. 3/8-inch wire rope, the design that senior officers had called ridiculous. Somewhere out in the Atlantic, German submarines were hunting, studying their charts, planning their approaches. Those charts showed clear passage beneath British nets at 90 feet. But the charts were wrong, and in 27 days, 3 U-boat commanders would learn exactly how wrong they were. April the 23rd, 1942. U-boat Pen, Lorient, France. Captain Lieutenant Wilhelm Kessler stood in the concrete shadow of the U-boat Pen, watching his crew load torpedoes into U-438. 31 years old, 9 merchant ships to his credit, the Iron Cross First Class on his tunic. The briefing had been clear. Convoy ON-92 was limping toward Scotland. 4 ships lost to wolf-pack attacks in mid-Atlantic. The survivors would scatter as they approached the Clyde, exhausted, vulnerable, rich targets. Kessler's navigator spread the charts across a makeshift table, British submarine net positions marked in red ink, updated monthly through aerial reconnaissance. The Abwehr's intelligence network was thorough, meticulous. Standard nets at the Clyde anchorage, Herr Cologne, positioned here and here, 90 feet depth. We passed beneath at 80 feet, exactly as before. Kessler had made this approach twice. Both times he'd slipped past British defences like a ghost. Both times he'd sent ships to the bottom within sight of supposed safety. The British were predictable. That was their weakness. Their heavy nets hung from the surface at fixed depths. Their patrol boats followed rigid schedules. Their convoy escorts relaxed within 10 miles of port. In his last letter to his wife Greta in Hamburg, Kessler had written, "The hardest part of this war is not the danger. It is the boredom between the hunts." WWII departed Lorient on April the 23rd at 0600 hours. The hunt would not be boring. April the 25th, 1942, 22:40 hours. Firth of Clyde. Fog lay thick across the water. Visibility less than 100 yards. Perfect conditions. U-438 ran on the surface at 8 knots, diesel engines rumbling. Kessler stood on the conning tower, binoculars scanning the darkness. 7 merchant ships somewhere ahead. HMS Volunteer shepherding them home. The irony wasn't lost on Blackwood. The same convoy designation, the same escort name as the ship that had died 4 months ago. Different vessel, different crew. The Royal Navy recycled everything in wartime, even the names of the dead. At 22:53 hours, the lookout aboard patrol trawler HMS Sycamore detected diesel engine noise bearing 270 degrees before they could issue a challenge. U-438's alarm klaxon shattered the silence. "Alarm!" Kessler's crash dive was textbook perfect. The submarine's bow tilted 15 degrees down. Ballast tanks flooded with a roar of incoming seawater. Within 30 seconds, U-438 slid beneath the surface, her conning tower disappearing into the black Atlantic. Depth, 20 feet. 30, 40, 50. "Level at 80 feet, Kessler ordered. "All ahead slow. Silent running." The charts showed British nets at 90 feet. Standard procedure, dive to 80, pass beneath, surface beyond the defense line. U-438 had done this before. But the charts were 3 months old. At 22:54 hours, traveling at 6 knots, U-438's bow struck Blackwood's net at 55 feet depth. The impact wasn't dramatic. No grinding collision, no tortured metal. Just a slight resistance against the forward momentum. Then the rendering winches began to feed. On the surface, Blackwood heard them first. The hydraulic governors hissing as they released tension. Exactly as designed. 80 pounds per square inch, yielding at 5,000 pounds of force. The net wasn't parting, it was wrapping. Inside U-438, the lights flickered red. "Starboard dive plane not responding," the plainsman's voice cracked with confusion. "Resistance on the control rod. It's jammed." 3/8-inch wire mesh, far too fine to cut with standard bow shears, had snagged on the submarine's dive planes. As U-438 continued forward, more net material fed out from the surface winches, enveloping the boat like a spider's web. Within 30 seconds, wire rope had fouled the starboard diving plane, wrapping around its mounting bracket. The plane jammed in the 15-degree down position. Kessler's response was immediate. "Both planes to rise. Emergency surface." But the port dive plane was already tangled. Locked in the dive position, U-438's automatic systems responded to the jammed planes by blowing ballast tanks. Compressed air roared through the chambers, but with both planes forcing the nose down and 200 feet of net now wrapped around the hull, the submarine couldn't surface. She began to sink. 60 feet, 70, 80. "Emergency blow, all tanks, all back full." U-438's propeller churned in reverse. The 7-bladed bronze screw, designed to push 750 tons of steel through the ocean, bit into the water and bit into the net. Wire rope began wrapping around the spinning shaft. The sound was indescribable, high-pitched, metallic, a scream of tortured bronze and steel as the propeller blade tips shredded through wire mesh that immediately tangled around the shaft behind them. Within seconds, the shaft seized. The submarine's only means of propulsion was dead. Aboard HMS Sycamore, the hydrophone operator tracked every sound. "Target is fouled, sir. Propeller has stopped. She's settling on the bottom. Blackwood grabbed the radio handset. His voice was steady. All patrol craft converge on grid reference Clyde 77. Submarine trapped in net barrier. Repeat. Submarine confirmed trapped. At 23:12 hours, unable to surface and with air quality deteriorating rapidly, Kessler made the only decision available. He ordered emergency ballast blow. U-438 broke the surface directly into the middle of Blackwood's patrol screen. 4 patrol trawlers and 2 motor torpedo boats surrounded the submarine within 3 minutes. Searchlights blazed across the water, illuminating a U-boat hopelessly entangled in wire mesh that looked nothing like the heavy nets on German intelligence charts. Unable to dive, unable to maneuver, her deck gun crews unable to reach their stations because the forward hatch was fouled with wire rope. Kessler stood on the conning tower, raised his hands, and surrendered his boat and 52 crew members without firing a shot. Blackwood watched from HMS Sycamore as German sailors climbed out of the U-boat's hatches, hands raised, faces pale in the searchlight glare. The net had worked. Christ, it had actually worked. McLeod stood beside him, grinning like a man who'd just landed the catch of his life. Told you it'd wrap like seaweed, Commander. It took salvage crews 18 hours to cut U-438 free. By then, Blackwood had filed his after-action report. Technical details, timeline, photographic evidence of the entanglement pattern. He sent it directly to Portsmouth, to Thornhill's office. The response came via telegram 6 hours later. Probable anomaly, await technical assessment, no further action authorized. Thornhill still didn't believe. April the 27th, 1942, 0200 hours. U-454 entered the Firth of Clyde running on the surface, her diesel engines barely audible above the wind. Kapitän Leutnant Friedrich Brandt was 29 years old. This was his 8th war patrol. He'd sunk 11 ships. The Knight's Cross hung at his throat. Brandt knew Kessler. They'd trained together, served in the same wolf pack 3 months ago. Good commander, aggressive, smart. German Naval Command in Lorient maintained strict radio silence during patrol operations. Security protocol. If Kessler had been sunk by destroyers, Brandt wouldn't know. If Kessler had returned to base early, Brandt wouldn't know. The last communication from U-438 had been 5 days ago. A standard position report, nothing unusual. Brandt studied the same charts Kessler had used. British nets at the Clyde marked clearly 90 feet depth. The Abwehr updated these charts monthly. They were reliable, they were also 48 hours obsolete. At 0340 hours, U-454's lookouts spotted patrol boats. Brandt ordered the standard crash dive, by the book. Exactly as Kessler had done. Exactly the same mistake. U-454 struck Blackwood's net at 57 feet depth, traveling at 6 knots. This time, Blackwood was ready. The hydrophone operator called it out like a choreographed dance. Contact, forward momentum decreasing, propeller pitch changing, she's fouling, sir. The rendering winches hissed, the net fed out. Wire mesh wrapped around dive planes, rudder, propeller shaft. 6 minutes from first contact to complete immobilization. U-454 settled on the bottom in 60 feet of water, her crew frantically trying to understand what had happened. Their charts showed clear passage. Their bow shears were designed to cut through British nets. But there was nothing to cut, just hundreds of crossing wires, each individually too light to stop, collectively forming a prison. At 0421 hours, Brandt attempted his own emergency ballast blow. He surfaced into a coordinated pattern of depth charges that forced immediate surrender. The second capture in 48 hours, April the 28th, 1942, Clyde anchorage. Captain Edmund Thornhill arrived on the morning ferry from Portsmouth. He hadn't slept. The Admiralty's technical board had demanded answers. 2 U-boats captured in 2 days by a net system they'd rejected 8 weeks ago. A net system designed by a commander with a formal reprimand in his file. Thornhill walked the length of both submarines where they lay secured to the dock. U-438's propeller shaft was still wrapped in wire rope. The salvage crews had given up trying to cut it free. They'd removed the entire shaft assembly, wire and all. He examined the mesh. 3/8 inch, exactly as Blackwood's diagrams had shown. Commander Morrison arrived with testing equipment, measured the tensile strength, calculated the entanglement coefficients, photographed the damage patterns on both submarines. Blackwood stood at a distance, silent. He'd learned not to speak first in these situations. Thornhill finally turned to face him. "Walk me through it, Commander." They spent 2 hours on the patrol boat. Blackwood explained the hydraulic governors, the yielding principle, how the net absorbed momentum instead of resisting it, how the fine mesh exploited the fundamental weakness of German bow shears. Morrison ran the calculations on a portable slide rule. The force distribution is exactly as Blackwood predicted. The submarine generates 8,000 pounds of forward thrust. The net yields at 5,000 pounds, preventing the wire from snapping. But the mesh spacing ensures multiple contact points, redundant fouling. He looked up at Thornhill. "It works, sir. Not despite being lighter, but because of it." Thornhill stood at the rail for a long time, watching the 2 captured submarines. Finally, he spoke. "I was wrong." 3 words. They seemed to cost him something. "The technical board was wrong. This system is more effective than anything we've deployed." He turned to Morrison. "I want a full field assessment report, technical analysis, cost comparison, implementation timeline for mass production. On my desk by tomorrow morning." Morrison nodded. Thornhill looked at Blackwood. "I put a reprimand in your file for wasting Admiralty resources. I'll be removing it, along with a formal commendation for innovative defensive systems that materially contributed to harbour security." "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me yet. If this works at scale, you're going to spend the next 6 months training every harbour commander in Britain." April 29th, 1942. Interrogation Room, Naval Intelligence. The German submariners sat in separate rooms, interviewed by different teams. Standard procedure: cross-reference their stories, find the gaps. What British intelligence found instead was gold. Both Kessler and Brandt had been carrying updated charts. March 1942 edition, the Abwehr's monthly intelligence summary for U-boat operations in British waters. The charts showed the location of every major net installation around the British Isles: Scapa Flow, Liverpool, Portsmouth, Plymouth, every harbour, every defensive position, updated through aerial reconnaissance. Remarkably accurate. Blackwood stood in the intelligence office studying the captured charts, red marks indicating net positions, depth measurements, patrol patterns. "They know everything," the intelligence officer said. "Every installation we've completed in the last year, down to specific depths and positioning." "Everything we'd completed by March," Blackwood corrected. "Sir, my net was installed March 22nd, after these charts were printed, after their last reconnaissance flight." The implications spread through the room like electricity. "Commander, if the Germans don't know about your net design, then every U-boat commander using these charts thinks they know exactly where British defences are, and exactly where they aren't." Blackwood traced the approach routes marked on the German charts. Standard tactics, predictable, based on complete intelligence that was now obsolete. "We haven't just caught 2 submarines," he said quietly. "We've blinded their entire coastal strategy." April 30, 1942, Admiralty Building, Portsmouth. Thornhill sat alone in his office. Morrison's technical report lay on his desk. 43 pages of analysis, all of it damning to the position Thornhill had taken 8 weeks ago. The cost comparison alone was devastating. Blackwood's system, £840 per section. Standard nets, £5,000. Installation time, 14 days versus 6 months. Performance, 2 submarines captured in 48 hours. Standard nets, penetrated routinely. Thornhill thought about his son. Lieutenant David Thornhill. Killed at Dunkirk, May 1940, 23 years old. The boy had argued with him once about rigid thinking in the military, about commanders who couldn't adapt, who sent men to die using tactics from the last war. Thornhill had told him that experience mattered, that the old ways had been proven. Then David had died on a beach in France, while commanders who'd learned nothing from the last war repeated the same mistakes. Thornhill pulled out a sheet of official letterhead. His hand trembled slightly as he wrote, Emergency Directive 43B. All harbour defence commanders are authorised to implement modified flexible net systems based on Commander Blackwood's Clyde installation. Standard nets at major installations will be supplemented with flexible barrier systems positioned forward of existing defences. Materials allocation for flexible net production receives Priority 2 classification, equivalent to destroyer construction. He signed it. Then he wrote a second document, a personal recommendation. Commander Alistair Blackwood demonstrated exceptional initiative and technical innovation in developing a harbour defence system superior to existing installations. His earlier proposal was rejected by this office in error. I hereby recommend him for promotion to captain and assignment to the Naval Research Section, where his talents can be properly utilised. My earlier rejection was in error. 7 words that might save thousands of lives. Thornhill sealed both documents and sent them to the Admiralty Council. The directive was transmitted to all fleet units on May 2nd, 1942. By then, a third U-boat was already approaching the Clyde. May 2nd, 1942. North Atlantic. Oberleutnant Otto Reinhardt was the youngest U-boat commander in the Kriegsmarine. 27 years old, this was his 3rd war patrol. He was eager, hungry to prove himself. His father had commanded U-boats in the First World War, sank 17 ships before the armistice. Reinhardt had grown up on those stories, the glory, the honour, the hunt. He studied the same charts his predecessors had used, British nets at 90 feet. At standard approach, surface in darkness, crash dive when challenged, pass beneath at 80 feet. The charts were dated March 1942. Reinhardt didn't know they were obsolete, didn't know that U-438 and U-454 had been captured using the exact tactics he was about to employ, didn't know that Blackwood's invisible defence was waiting. May 4th, 1942, 21:30 hours. Emergency Directive 43B had reached 12 harbour installations. Work had begun immediately, materials allocated, fishing crews mobilised. Blackwood had spent the previous 48 hours travelling between ports, training commanders, supervising installations. He was back at the Clyde when the 3rd submarine came. The pattern was identical. Surface approach, crash dive, forward momentum at 6 knots. This time, Blackwood watched from beginning to end. 22:45 hours, U-569 struck the net at 54 feet. The rendering winches hissed, the net fed out. Wire wrapped around dive planes, rudder, propeller shaft. Reinhardt tried everything, emergency reverse, blowing ballast, angling the planes, nothing worked. At 01:45 hours on May 5th, U-569 surfaced and surrendered. 51 crew members, 1 more Iron Cross, handed over to British intelligence. 3 submarines, 9 days, April 25th through May 4th, 1942. Blackwood stood on the patrol boat, watching the 3rd U-boat being towed to dock. MacLeod stood beside him, smoking a cigarette. "They still don't know, do they?" MacLeod said. "Their charts are wrong. And they still don't know. They will soon, Blackwood replied. Word will get out. They'll adapt, but by then we'll have 40 ports protected with these systems. How many boats do you think we'll save, Commander? Blackwood thought about the volunteer. 180 men. Thought about the merchant ships that would make it to port. The food that would reach London, the weapons that would reach the front. Enough, he said finally. God willing, enough. May 5th, 1942, 0800 hours. The telegram arrived at 43 British ports simultaneously. Emergency Directive 43B. Implement Blackwood Net System immediately. Priority 2. Classification, materials en route. Harbour commanders from Liverpool to Plymouth opened identical packets. Technical diagrams, installation procedures, cost estimates, and a single photograph of 3 German U-boats sitting at dock, their propeller shafts wrapped in wire mesh that looked absurdly delicate. The caption read, 3 submarines, 9 days, 0 British casualties. Within 24 hours, fishing companies across Britain received contracts. Wire rope manufacturers went to double shifts. Hydraulic equipment suppliers diverted materials from civilian production. The revolution had begun. May 15th, 1942. Glasgow. Blackwood stood in a warehouse that had become the nerve centre of the largest rapid deployment naval defence project in British history. Wall charts tracked progress at 43 installations. Red pins showed completion, yellow showed ongoing work, green showed planning stages. MacLeod coordinated teams of fishermen who'd become the world's foremost experts in submarine net installation. 200 men who'd been unemployed 3 months ago. Men who understood nets the way naval architects understood blueprints. Liverpool completed this morning, MacLeod reported. Portsmouth tomorrow. Plymouth by the 20th. We're ahead of schedule, Commander. Blackwood studied the charts. Each installation represented ships that would make it to port, convoys that would deliver their cargo, men who would live. The cost comparison sat on his desk. Standard net program for 43 ports, £15 million. Estimated completion time, 4 years. Blackwood system, £2.1 million. Completion time, 3 months. The savings alone could build 30 destroyers, but the real value wasn't measured in pounds sterling. June 8, 1942, Admiralty Building, Portsmouth. The ceremony was brief. Thornhill had insisted on that. This was wartime. No time for lengthy celebrations. Captain Edmund Thornhill pinned the Distinguished Service Order to Blackwood's uniform. The medal felt heavy, heavier than it should. By order of the Admiralty Council, Commander Alistair Blackwood is hereby promoted to the rank of captain, effective immediately, for exceptional initiative and technical innovation in developing harbour defence systems that have materially contributed to the security of His Majesty's naval installations. Thornhill stepped back, lowered his voice so only Blackwood could hear. I was comprehensively wrong, Captain, about your design, about your methods, about what was possible. He paused. You had the courage to be right when I was too proud to see it. I just did the mathematics, sir. No, you did more than that. You refused to accept "that's how we've always done it" as an answer. That takes a different kind of courage. Thornhill handed him new orders. Portsmouth Naval Research Section, you'll develop improved net designs, train harbour defence specialists, and you'll have the authority to implement whatever you think will work. No more conference room votes. Blackwood took the orders, thought about Professor Ashford. The old man had died 3 weeks ago. Lung cancer. He'd lived long enough to see the first 20 installations completed, lived long enough to know his investment had paid off. Permission to name the system, sir? Granted. The Ashford Net. After Professor Cedric Ashford, who taught me to question assumptions. Thornhill nodded. Approved. The Ashford Net, it is. July 1942. The statistics. The numbers arrived in manila folders marked Secret, compiled by Naval Intelligence, cross-referenced with German documents, analyzed by statisticians who turned death into data. Merchant vessel losses within 10 miles of British harbours, January through April 1942, 47 ships, 218,000 tons, estimated 3,200 casualties. May through August 1942, 3 ships, 14,000 tons, estimated 190 casualties, 93% reduction. Convoy ON-92, the convoy that had led U-438 into Blackwood's net, delivered 42,000 tons of American war materials to Britain. Without the Ashford net, German intelligence estimates suggested at least 4 of those 7 surviving ships would have been sunk at the harbour approaches. The convoy's cargo included 8,000 tons of aviation fuel, 1,200 tons of ammunition, 3,000 tons of steel, 2,000 tons of food, medical supplies for 15 field hospitals, materials that kept Spitfires flying, kept artillery firing, kept soldiers fed and wounded men alive, 1 net installation, 1 captured U-boat, 1 convoy saved. Multiply that by 43 ports. The mathematics of survival. October 1942, Lorient, France. Admiral Karl Dönitz stood in the U-boat operations room, studying reports that made no sense. Since May, U-boat losses in British coastal waters had increased 400%, not from destroyers, not from aircraft, from unknown obstacles that weren't marked on any chart. The survivors described the same thing: fine mesh nets, appearing at depths where no nets should exist, wrapping around propeller shafts, strangling submarines like weeds. The latest intelligence summary confirmed it. The British had deployed a new net system, lighter, faster to install, positioned forward of existing defences. Dönitz issued new standing orders to all U-boat commanders: extreme caution approaching British coastal installations. Assumed defensive positions have changed. Previous intelligence regarding net depths and locations may be obsolete. Harbour approach attacks are hereby classified as high-risk operations. The psychological impact was immediate. U-boat commanders who'd previously viewed British harbours as target-rich environments now avoided them entirely. The approach to the Clyde, once a reliable hunting ground, became a zone of fear. Former easy kills became missions no commander wanted. The British hadn't just deployed a new weapon, they'd weaponized uncertainty. German U-boat tactics shifted, forced back into mid-Atlantic hunting, forced into areas where British convoy escorts were stronger, better coordinated, more lethal. The Ashford net didn't just save ships, it redirected the entire Battle of the Atlantic. November 1942, Clyde anchorage. The 3 captured U-boats sat in dry dock, surrounded by naval architects and intelligence officers who'd spent 6 months taking them apart. U-438 had been recommissioned into Royal Navy service as HMS Graf. Her crew, British volunteers who'd learned to operate German equipment. Her mission, patrol against German shipping. The irony pleased Blackwood more than he cared to admit. But the real value of the captures wasn't the boats themselves, it was what came with them. Codebooks, construction specifications, tactical procedures. The entire operational doctrine of the U-boat service, wrapped in 3 steel hulls and delivered to British intelligence. The captured documents contributed to breaking German naval codes, understanding submarine construction weaknesses, predicting U-boat deployment patterns. 3 submarines caught in 9 days. The intelligence harvest from those captures would influence anti-submarine warfare for the rest of the war. Sometimes victory came from weapons, sometimes it came from fishing nets. May 1945. The end. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Final count. The Ashford net system had been installed at 67 British ports and naval installations. extended to Allied harbors in North Africa and the Mediterranean, adopted by the US. Navy for Pacific operations. British naval historians spent the next year compiling statistics. Estimated submarine attacks prevented by Ashford net installations, 1942 to 1945, 60 to 70 attacks. Given that German submarines typically achieved a 40% hit rate in harbor approach attacks, the system likely saved 25 to 30 merchant vessels. Approximately 200,000 tons of shipping, between 2,000 and 3,000 Allied lives. The ships that survived carried food that prevented starvation, fuel that kept the war machine running, weapons that armed the troops who liberated Europe. One engineer's refusal to accept, "That's how we've always done it." One investment by a dying professor. One team of fishermen who understood nets better than admirals. Mathematics that saved an island nation. 1947. Portsmouth. Captain Edmund Thornhill's memoir was published in the spring of 1947. Reflections on naval command in wartime. It sold modestly. Most war memoirs did, but one passage was quoted in naval academies for decades afterward. "I was comprehensively wrong about Commander Blackwood's net design. I rejected it based on assumptions forged in the previous war and refined through 20 years of peacetime theorizing. I failed to see that strength and rigidity could become weaknesses, that the solution to an impossible problem might not be more force, but different thinking." Innovation in warfare rarely comes from making existing systems stronger. It comes from seeing problems differently, from questioning assumptions, from having the moral courage to proceed when the establishment says no. Commander Blackwood saved thousands of lives, not because he was smarter than the rest of us, but because he refused to let "we've always done it this way" be the final answer. That is a lesson every commander should learn, and one I learned too late. Blackwood read the book in his office at the Portsmouth Naval Research Section. He was 43 now, captain, decorated, respected. His wife Margaret brought him tea. They'd married in 1943. She was a naval architect herself. They'd met at a conference on harbor defense systems. "He finally admitted it publicly," she said. "Took him 5 years. Better late than never." Blackwood thought about Thornhill. The man had spent the rest of the war advocating for junior officer innovations, had pushed the Admiralty to listen to ideas from unexpected sources, had become, in his way, an ally. He was a good commander, Blackwood said, just needed to remember what it was like to be wrong. 1952. The legacy. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization adopted the Ashford Net principle for harbor defenses across member nations. The design evolved: lighter materials, Kevlar-reinforced cables, sensor-integrated mesh that could detect submarines before contact, but the core principle remained: yield to absorb, tangle to defeat. The Soviet Union developed their own version, so did the French, the Italians, the Japanese. By 1960, when the Ashford Net system was finally declassified, flexible barrier harbor defense had become the global standard. Naval academies taught Blackwood's design as a case study in innovation, not just the technical aspects, the human aspects. How to challenge established thinking, how to proceed when authority says no, how to prove yourself right by building something that works. The lesson wasn't about submarine nets, it was about refusing to accept impossible. Present day, Imperial War Museum, London. HMS Graf sits in permanent display. 750 tons of German engineering captured by British ingenuity, restored, preserved. Next to the submarine, a section of the original Ashford Net. Wire mesh that looks absurdly delicate, 3/8 of an inch, 6-foot spacing. The plaque reads, Commander Alistair Blackwood's Flexible Net System, 1942. 3 German U-boats captured in 9 days, April the 25th through May 4th, 1942. Cost, £840 per installation versus £5,000 for standard nets. Installation time, 14 days versus 6 months. Result, 93% reduction in harbour approach losses, May to December 1942. Estimated 2,000 to 3,000 Allied lives saved. Sometimes the most ridiculous idea is the one that works. Captain Edmund Thornhill, 1947. School groups pass through. Veterans stop and stare. Naval officers study the mesh, calculating force distributions in their heads. And occasionally someone asks the question, how did fishing nets defeat the German Navy? The answer is simple, they didn't. One engineer who refused to quit defeated the German Navy. The nets were just his weapon. Epilogue. Alistair Blackwood died in 1984 at the age of 80. Retired Rear Admiral, naval architect, teacher, mentor to a generation of engineers who learned to question assumptions. His funeral was attended by former students, fellow officers, and 3 elderly men who'd served on fishing trawlers in 1942. MacLeod had died in 1978, but his sons came, brought a length of wire rope, 3/8 of an inch. They laid it on Blackwood's coffin. "Your father taught us to think differently," one of the sons said. "Taught us that the old ways aren't always the best ways, that sometimes you have to trust the mathematics even when everyone else says you're wrong." The memorial service included readings from Thornhill's memoir, testimonials from harbour commanders who'd used the Ashford net, statistics about ships saved and lives preserved. But the moment that mattered most came at the end. A young naval officer, 26 years old, fresh from the academy, approached Blackwood's widow. "I just wanted to say, I studied your husband's work, the Ashford net. The principle of flexible defense, it changed how I think about problems, about innovation, about what's possible." Margaret Blackwood smiled. He'd be pleased to hear that. He always said the best legacy wasn't the nets themselves. It was teaching people to question whether impossible really means impossible. And the officer nodded, saluted, walked away. And somewhere in harbours around the world, nets hung in the water, lighter, stronger, more advanced than Blackwood could have imagined, but still based on the principle he'd proven in April 1942, that sometimes the solution isn't more force, it's different thinking. 3 submarines in 9 days, not because the nets were stronger, because one engineer refused to accept that the old way was the only way, because a dying professor invested in the future, because fishermen understood what admirals had forgotten, because 840 pounds of wire mesh proved more effective than 5,000 pounds of rigid steel. The mathematics were simple, the courage was not. But Alistair Blackwood had watched 180 men die on HMS Volunteer because the old defences failed. And he'd decided that was 180 men too many, so he built something different, something ridiculous, something that worked. And in doing so, he saved thousands of lives that would never know his name. That's the definition of heroism. Not the glory, not the recognition, just the quiet mathematics of doing what's right, even when the world calls you ridiculous, even when your career hangs in the balance, even when every expert says it can't be done. You build it anyway, you prove them wrong, you save lives. And maybe, if you're lucky, someone remembers why it mattered. 3 submarines, 9 days, April 25th through May 4th, 1942. The week that proved stubbornness beats genius. The week that proved different thinking saves lives. The week that proved the most ridiculous idea is sometimes the one that changes the world.